has changed a lot since the 19th century. Nowadays, transvestism is just something you do in your free time, but 120 years ago or so, it was the only way for a woman to earn a living. Women cross-dressing as men in order to gain employment and status is a long-standing tradition in fiction. Whereas men seem to need some ridiculous, convoluted excuse for their cross-dressing, for women, simply being around before 1920 is reason enough. But how common was this outside of fairy tales? In America, roughly 400 women passed themselves off as men in order to fight in the Civil War, although God knows why they'd want to, maybe to gain a little power and status. One of them, Albert Cashier, was never discovered while enlisted, and spent a further 50 years living as a man after the war ended. However, today we're not going to be looking at the Civil War. We'll instead be turning our attention to something a little more mythical, the Old West, when men were busy shooting each other in the face when they weren't dying of dysentery. Yes, it's time for historical forays into genderfuckery. This is 1993's The Ballad of Little Joe. Josephine is a woman in the 1880s who sleeps with a photographer and gets pregnant. Her family then decide it'll be really cool to tell her to go to hell, so Josephine leaves her baby with her sister and decides to make her own way in the world. Unfortunately, this is the 1880s, so there's not really much that Josephine can do with herself. She is continually hassled by men, and after two soldiers pursue her through the night with the intention of raping her, Josephine decides enough is enough and proceeds to reinvent herself as a man. Unlike Irene Adler, however, Jo doesn't actually fucking suck at passing. She cuts her hair, and in order to give herself an appropriately withdrawn masculine facade, she slices her own fucking face open with a straight razor. Let the pronoun trouble begin. Jo goes to Ruby City, which isn't really so much as a city as a row of tents, full of withdrawn, hard-bitten people who nearly chase Jo out of the town for being a dude.
We don't like dudes around here. We had a dude dropped in here the other day, had on black and yellow stockings.
Striped. We run him out of town, barefoot.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like, your opinion, man.
No, not that kind of dude. A dude was a worthless city slicker who decided to make money on the frontier and was looked down upon by all those working-class, hard-bitten frontiersmen who wanted to keep it real, yo, and not have the frontier overrun with posers. Ugh, that was the most 90s sentence I ever hoped to say in a review of a Western film.
I guess you better take off your boot. See, Frank, I told you you weren't no dude.
That's what I said.
No offense, but there's nothing I hate more than a dude.
So anyway, the inhabitants of the glorious Ruby City decide that Jo's alright, and they'll put up with Jo. Jo falls in with Percy, who teaches Jo how to cook, and tells Jo about a job going. We eventually learn that Percy is a bit of a fucking asshole when a prostitute comes to town and Percy attempts to give her the Mr. Blonde treatment.
Percy!
Jo!
Give me the gun, Percy.
She wouldn't put it in her mouth.
Let's go home.
Yeah, you need a good shagging too, Jo. Everybody thinks something wrong with you.
Anyway, possibly because of discovering that Percy is an asshole, Jo decides to take up a lonely job as a shepherd, eventually becoming an awesome gunslinger with a wolfskin coat. After months out in the wilderness, Jo returns to town. While Jo's there, Percy says that he read a letter from Jo's sister, meaning that he now knows that Jo's a woman. Of course, any woman is fair game for Ian McKellen, and he decides immediately to attempt to rape Jo, who manages to overpower him and pay him off instead. Percy leaves town and takes Jo's secret with him. Cut to 5 years later, Jo buys a homestead and runs sheep. Meanwhile, the town is all abuzz because the Western Cattle Company is coming. Ah, the Sheep Wars! In the Old West, the shepherds and the cattlemen fought bitterly over grazing rights. Anyway, that's just about enough history for now. On with the plot of the movie.
Get hanging on
Let him go, Frank.
He ain't a man, he's a celestial heathen.
Cut him down, Frank.
Whoa. Don't shoot.
All right, Joe, all right. Who's gonna feed him, Joe?
What are you talking about?
I'm saying you should hire him, little Joe.
What?
If I let him go, he's probably gonna starve to death because there ain't no work around here for no Chinaman. Or he'll move on and take some job away from some white man, unless, of course, you hire him to cook and keep house.
Yeah. You are a drunken pain in the ass.
Too lonely out there, you need company.
I don't want company.
You'll go crazy without it. I've seen it happen to men. And it worries me.
Who asked you to worry about me?
I can't help it.
Joe employs a Chinese man, Tin Man, as a cook. Since Tin Man is near full, he works out Joe's true gender in 3 days, but since he too is a social outcast, he keeps Joe's secret, and the two become lovers. Heterosexuality? What are you doing here? To cut a long story short, the Western Cattle Company come from the Daniel Plainview school of capitalism. In other words, buy everyone out and kill everyone else who gets in the way. They completely slaughter a Russian family whom Joe was friendly with, and they attempt to murder Joe, only to have Joe take them out with crack gunslinging skills. Many years later, Joe's friend Frank comes to visit and sees that Joe's unwell. On the way to town, Joe dies. The townsfolk reminisce about Joe's strange withdrawn ways, only to have the undertaker suddenly bust in and reveal a giant bombshell of a fact.
It's the Ballad of Joe. Well, speak up, man. What about him? He was a woman.
Okay, so that's the Ballad of Little Joe, which so far remains the queerest western that I've ever seen. The second queerest western that I've ever seen. But while it may be one of the only gender-bending westerns out there, it certainly isn't the only movie set in the 1800s about a woman passing themselves off as male in order to survive. While Joe was out ranching and shooting wolves, on the other side of the world another individual was trying to make a living, keeping their head down and trying to go unnoticed, in completely different circumstances. The name of that individual? Albert Nobbs. Albert Nobbs is a 2011 movie about, well, much the same thing. Let's dive into the plot, shall we? Albert Nobbs is a waiter in a Dublin hotel, a place that seems to have an improbably large amount of queer visitors. He's trying to live a discreet life, squirreling money away under the floorboards, and trying his utmost to make sure that no one finds out about his severe penis deficiency. However, all that changes when a tradesman comes to paint the hotel. The hotelier is cheap and nasty and insists that the painter, Mr. Page, share the room with Albert while he stays to work. That night, Page discovers Albert's lack of penis, but doesn't seem to be all that bothered by it because he lacks a penis too!
Your secret's safe with me. It's just unfired, in case Mrs. Baker.
What a twist! 2 trans men in the one hotel in 1890s Ireland? What with this and all of the gay sex and indiscreet drag that goes on, I'm beginning to think that this is some kind of transatlantic equivalent of Fire Island. Albert is intrigued and thankful to find another man like him, and asks Mr. Page about his life, finding out that Page has a wife.
How did you manage it?
What?
To marry. Easy. You could do it yourself.
Following Mr. Page's example of glorious matrimony, Albert decides that he'll get himself a wife too, but he doesn't seem to understand how sexuality is supposed to work. He tries to date Helen, a maid at the hotel, but she finds Albert's lack of sexuality weird, and isn't on board with Albert's preemptive plans of the life the two will have together.
It's not natural to be just talking. Never wanting to put your arm around a girl's waist.
But that's for when we're married.
Married? Sometimes I think you're soft in the head, did you know that? What kind of man would ask a girl to marry him without ever having so much as kissed her?
Also, she's currently banging some other guy, a bit of a jerk who also works at the hotel. The jerk's main goal is to move to America to make his fortune, and Helen wants to go with him. The jerk thinks Albert's dating attempts are weird, but he sees a financial opportunity to be had in fleecing Albert's floorboard money. So he tells Helen to string Albert along for as long as possible. You may be wondering what Albert was saving all of that money for. Well, he wants to own a tobacco store, and finds himself just the very establishment. Note the cholera posters in the background. Is this some kind of foreshadowing? Suddenly, things start to go wrong. Half the hotel falls gravely ill, including Albert, but in a shocking twist, it isn't from the cholera outbreak, it's from typhoid. Wow, way to throw us a red herring there and make us think that it was one disease borne by poor sanitation, when in fact, it was another disease borne by poor sanitation. At least it wasn't dysentery. Albert falls sick, but gets better. After the outbreak, Albert goes to visit Mr. Page, only to find that his wife Kathleen has died. Albert completely ignores Mr. Page's grief, as if he's some kind of socially maladjusted Dali weirdo, and asks him to join him in his grand retail enterprise. Mr. Page isn't so keen on the idea, owing to the fact that, you know, his wife just died, and he has his own business already.
What are you saying?
But just in case you thought that wasn't awkward and stilted enough, we next have a very weird scene where the two run along the beach wearing dresses and looking extremely awkward, because the filmmakers had to remind us that they both had female bodies, since, of course, they were all really women inside. Oh, go jump, why don't you? You can definitely tell that this is a queer gender-bending period drama made for people who don't watch a lot of queer gender-bending period dramas. Joe puts on a dress because Joe misses life as a woman. Here, neither character seems to miss their previous life in the slightest. Hell, Albert refuses to even acknowledge it.
What's your name?
Albert.
Your real name?
Albert.
So them putting on dresses in a nostalgic desire for a life that they want absolutely nothing to do with, and don't even seem to identify with, makes absolutely no sense at all. So after this pointless scene, we then go back to the hotel, where we find out that Helen is pregnant.
I'm sorry.
Well, that's what happens when you have unprotected sex multiple times with someone who has a functioning penis, you idiot! That's why every other guy in this movie sticks to cunnilingus and sodomy. Anyway, Helen finally realizes that Mr. Ejaculating Penis here is a bit of a jerk, and he never intended to take her to America with him. A fight ensues, and Albert bravely rushes in to save Helen, only to be hit on the head and have a bit of a headache. No, because this movie runs on Victorian novel logic, he gets hit on the head and gets amnesia. No, actually, he gets hit on the head and dies. Enjoy your unsatisfying conclusion! After Albert's sudden anticlimactic death, we skip forward in time to find out that the proprietor of the hotel is still a total tool, and keeps Helen in indentured unpaid servitude. Thankfully, Mr. Page comes along and decides to rescue her. So that's the end. In terms of tales of female-bodied individuals passing themselves off as men in the Victorian era, Albert Nobbs isn't really the best. The Ballad of Little Joe is simply a much better movie, with a much more strong-willed and interesting main character. Here, the story seems rather weak, and the abrupt ending doesn't come across as tragic or dramatic. It just seems like the author got bored of the story and wrote down, and then Albert got hit on the head and died. So we have two different movies with a very similar character arc. While one movie is clearly the superior choice, there is another very important question to consider. How did all of the characters do as gender hipsters? The Ballad of Little Joe is one of the most convincing and believable portrayals of a gender hipster that I have ever seen. When Jo begins to live life as a man, she's unsure of how to act, and speaks in a forced, low voice, her only expression being an awkward grimace.
Most men around here are digging for gold.
I don't mind striking gold. Where can I get outfitted?
Even when Jo becomes more self-assured, Jo acts in a withdrawn, cold manner towards others, so that no one will get close and find out Jo's secret. Jo lives life in fear, but even that is a lesser burden than trying to live life as a woman with no family or connections. Jo is in some ways an asshole, but this is completely understandable, seeing as Jo can't let down Jo's guard in any way, and being callous is Jo's only defense, even though being so hard does not come naturally. When Jo kills the cattle company hitman, Jo is distraught and an emotional wreck. And in regards to Jo's child, they never once again meet, because Jo's sister realized that Jo wasn't coming back and told the child that Jo was dead. The only emotional support Joe has is having at least one character around who can see who Joe really is. Tin Man is a mutual outcast and allows Joe the chance to be feminine, to be vulnerable, and to connect with someone else. Tin Man supports Joe's decision, saying that he feels more of a connection with Joe in Joe's current state than as Joe would have been as Josephine.
Who is this society girl?
Me. Can you imagine?
I like you much better as you are.
Why?
This white girl would never do this with me.
However, does Joe stick with the decision for life because Joe feels that it is necessary, or because Joe identifies as a man? It's in some ways hard to tell. Although being masculine is initially a trial for Joe, and does not allow expression of some of Joe's true thoughts and feelings, Joe is allowed much more autonomy and respect as a man. As a woman, Josephine has lost her virtue, which is apparently the only thing that a woman can have. And so she is worth nothing. As a man, Joe has worth. However, all this masculinity takes a toll on Joe, who eventually makes the decision to live as a woman again. Tin Man tells Joe that this is a terrible idea, and both of them will be killed. Reluctantly, Joe concedes that this is true, and resumes living as male. Joe is probably not transgender, but is able to pass as a man, and not just any man, a complete badass, for the rest of Joe's life. Gender hipster? But gender hipster, this is a crock of complete crap! You're probably saying while sitting at your computer and peeling off the plastic of one of those sloppy squares of American cheese? But no, the Ballad of Little Joe is based on a true story, and not just in one of those vague September the 11th conspiracy theory ways. It's not directly stated in the movie, but it's clear that the character is inspired by the Wild West stagecoach driver Charlie Parkhurst, who drove coaches for Wells Fargo. Charlie was a one-eyed badass who happened to be born female, but lived as a male ever since he left the orphanage where he grew up. His true sex was never discovered until his death, and like Joe, he had also given birth to a child. So yes, this really happened. But if The Ballad of Little Joe is a nuanced, well-acted and realistic portrayal of 19th century gender fuckery, then what about Albert Nobbs? This movie really does seem like gender fuckery 101. It's not trying to portray the situation for humour, and it's very careful to avoid being offensive, but the movie ends up being painfully self-conscious in the way that it presents itself. Humorless, painfully self-conscious, hesitant and hard to relate to? This movie is just like Albert himself! It's hard to say whether a character like this is trans, or just living as male because of society, yo, but here we have a very stark contrast between Albert and Mr. Page. Albert is reserved, cringing and wholly consumed with never being found out, whereas Mr. Page seems to be very comfortable with himself, his presentation and his life.
Hubert Page, have you dealt with that damn pouch yet?
Ah, you're a terrible slave driver, Mrs. Donahue, so you are.
Aha, and you're just a big lazy man. Not jar, big lazy man, that's my new name.
He has much greater conviction than Albert, and is a much more interesting character. Janet McTeer's performance is convincing and excellent. Mr. Page is the best character here, and the film would be sorely lacking without him. Something feels missing from Albert Nobbs. It doesn't have the fleshed-out ensemble cast and grand sweeping vision of a good television period drama, but it also lacks the strong central character and good storyline of other filmic period pieces. There are glimpses of a more interesting movie there, mainly through Mr. Page, but on the whole, the movie pivots on a lukewarm and awkward not-love story, and ends up only achieving mediocrity. It's in no way offensive. The situation isn't ever mined for humour, but it's also too nervous to challenge the viewer. All this film manages to achieve is to go completely unnoticed, much like Albert himself. The history is fairly accurate, except perhaps for the slightly unrealistic amount of queer activity, which would have made for a more interesting film if they'd just run for it. It's safe, accessible, chaste, and entirely uninteresting. Who would have thought that a film about a man trying so hard to be anonymous could be so completely forgettable? Both movies feature characters with ominously scarred faces, and both movies feature characters who begin passing as male to avoid ever-present threats of sexual violence. The Ballad of Little Joe is a pretty good western, featuring a totally badass main character, who is also a gender hipster. I mean, how can you pass that up? Plus, it's got Ian McKellen in it, even though there isn't necessarily the proof of a good movie in and of itself. But clearly this is the superior pick, Go out and watch it, and pull it out of the obscurity that it's currently languishing in.
Thank you.
Albert Nobbs, on the other hand...
Dear Jesus, I don't know what makes people live such miserable lives.
I'd advise you to give this colourless, cringing transgender tale a miss, and watch something else instead. Something without this scene in it. So that was the Ballad of Little Joe and Albert Nobbs. On the surface very similar, but in reality two vastly different sides of the same coin. And now I feel strangely tempted to walk around in a wolfskin coat.
This is a man's world. This is a man's world. But it wouldn't be nothing, nothing without a woman or a girl.